Hello, and welcome to How Green is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality. This podcast is part of GreenDeal-NET, a Jean Monnet network that brings together research and teaching on EU climate and sustainability governance. My name is Jana Geuns. I'm a researcher at the Brussels School of Governance and the VUB, and in today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the European Green Deal. What is it about, and why did the EU formulate it? With me today, I have Sebastian Oberthür, a professor at the Brussels School of Governance and University of Eastern Finland, who has a long career of working on international and European climate governance. Hi, Sebastian. Welcome to the podcast. Let's delve right in with the questions. What actually is the European Green Deal? How should we understand it?
Yeah, the European Green Deal was actually launched in 2019 by the new European Commission under President von der Leyen. And it is essentially not only about greening Europe, but actually also developing it economically. So it's an economic strategy towards climate neutrality and sustainability by 2050.
What are some of the instruments, some of the parts of the European Green Deal? How does the EU want to reach these goals?
Yeah, first was actually that these goals were made legally binding. So one of the first results was the European climate law that was adopted in 2021 and established the climate neutrality target for 2050, as well as the increased emission reduction objective for 2030, which is 55% emission reduction of greenhouse gases compared to 1990. And then, it's a pretty comprehensive program and strategy. It's not itself, obviously, a law, but a strategy that then needs to be translated into laws. So one of the biggest packages then is the Fit for 55 package, which contains all the legislation that is required to achieve the 55% emission reduction target by 2030. But then also taking into account that we need to be at climate neutrality by 2050. So it is actually also going a little bit beyond 2030 in the whole concept of it. And it's a big package of many, many legislative proposals addressing the emissions trading system, the emissions outside of the emissions trading system, something that's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is about taxing carbon emissions in products at the border, and a lot more. So the Fit for 55 package. There's also other elements in there. The European Climate Pact has been launched by the European Commission as well, which addresses more local and regional initiatives, so working with citizens in Europe. And we should not forget that the European Green Deal is much more than just climate. It's about sustainability. So in principle, it should also address a range of other environmental challenges, biodiversity loss, chemical management, etc., etc. So it's not only climate, although obviously climate is in the center of it.
So it does sound like quite a comprehensive package that the EU has now, or the European Commission has now formulated for it. Is it the first time that the EU does something like this, or has it done something similar before?
Well, perhaps two points in response. European climate policy has always developed over the past years in packages. So there have been packages before. There was a European climate and energy policy package for 2020 for achieving the emission reduction targets for 2020, which was a 20% emission reduction, which was overachieved. Then there was already before the European Green Deal, there was the emission reduction target for 2030 of reducing by 40%, and that was also implemented in the package before it was now strengthened under the European Green Deal. So there have been these packages already. So the European Green Deal, in a sense, could be seen as a further package, although it's wider, and we can perhaps go into detail on how it is different. But there's perhaps also one thing, because we have had other economic strategies in the EU. So just to name the Lisbon strategy at the beginning of the 2000s, which is aiming at making the EU the most competitive economy in the world, etc., etc. And in a way, the European Green Deal is also succeeding that and replacing that by putting the environment and climate centrally in the economic development strategy also, and trying to bring
kind of these previous avenues of packages or strategies that the EU had and integrating them together.
Yes. A lot of the European Green Deal, as I read it, is about policy integration, is about bringing together the many environmental issues that we have, but bringing together also the many other policy areas and make them play together. Economy, but then also the social sphere. Also looking at foreign policy and how to integrate that. So it's really one of the major themes is policy integration, and perhaps climate policy integration and environmental policy integration, getting the climate theme into all these other policy areas and taking it into account in developing those policy areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how I understand it, and still makes it a new innovation that the EU has made. Why did the EU come up with such a comprehensive strategy at this point?
There's obviously not one factor that accounts for that, for such a big step somehow in the strategy development. In the background, there were obviously the Fridays for Future movement and a lot of more mass mobilization in favor of climate and environmental protection. So kind of the time seemed ripe to go that step from the support basis in society. There was obviously also the particular moment when in 2019 were the European elections, and then the new Commission needed to come on board. And as you may recall, the new president of the Commission, von der Leyen, was not the first candidate. But she then needed to be approved also by the parliament. She needed to convince parliament that she is the right candidate, she's the right president for the forthcoming commission. And one of the big issues, and that then perhaps translates back to the mass mobilization for the topic, was climate. And the attempt to also get the support of those who are particularly concerned in the European Parliament, like the Greens, for that candidacy. And that is where the root then politically also of the European Green Deal was, where she said, okay, this is my way of tackling that subject by combining it also and making it the growth and economic growth strategy for the EU. And that all obviously also in the times of the Paris Agreement, where we had in 2018 the 1.5 degree report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which pointed out that we need to do more and we need to aim at limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees. So that all was the mixture that perhaps produced then the European Green Deal.
Mm-hmm. So lots of internal and external factors working together to create the right time for it. Of course, the European Green Deal was first launched by the European Commission in 2019. Since then, we've had a couple of big crisis events in Europe and in the world. First, the COVID-19 pandemic, then Russia invading Ukraine, followed by an energy crisis. How have these impacted the European Green Deal?
Yeah, perhaps two major developments, I would say, in response. First, perhaps surprisingly, the European Green Deal wasn't abandoned as a response. With respect to previous crises, we have sometimes seen that climate and the environment lost relevance. And there were attacks in the course of these crises by certain industries, etc., saying, okay, we now need to give priority to economic development, etc., and we need to downscale a little bit our ambitions on climate and the environment. That has not really materialized, and I would say especially with respect to the climate component of the European Green Deal. What has actually happened in response to this crisis is that investments have been upscaled in Europe. And a major emphasis in doing so was actually investment in climate protection, investment in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in solutions. And a lot of the plans with the European Green Deal, actually, when they emerged at the end of 2019, one could have doubts whether they would come about because there was a lack of investment instruments actually supporting those. And the COVID recovery funding, but also the Repower EU now actually provide more funding for the climate transition. So in a way, it has even accelerated or helped to implement the transition as it was supposed to happen. We still need to see some of the results, whether everything really comes out as it was planned in the recovery plans, etc. But that may actually have been beneficial for the implementation of the Green Deal and the climate component of it. What we now can see, I think, especially in respect to and in response to the Ukraine crisis and the energy crisis, is actually that some of the other environmental components of the Green Deal are actually suffering, because there's a lot of pressure by industry not to have further burdens, etc., what they perceive as burdens. And we see that, for example, the reform of the chemicals regulation in the EU of REACH is postponed and will probably not happen anymore during this legislative term. And we see on a few other files as well that these are suffering as a result of the crisis and the pressure that comes with it from industry, etc.
So it is a bit of a mixed bag of impacts, especially then on the entire strategy of the European Green Deal. As a final question, more of a personal interest one, what in your opinion is the best or the most efficient individual action someone can take to combat climate change?
There's not only one. There's many things. Many things that we can do.
If you have to pick one, which one would it be?
I'm torn in between not flying, which is one of the activities that we're all, well, many of us are doing, which has a very big impact on climate and the environment. And actually it depends a little bit on your personal circumstances. Like, we live in a house, and I've just made a major effort insulating the house, putting renewables on the roof, etc. That can also make a big difference. But not everybody has the opportunity to do that. So, yeah, I find it difficult to choose the one that you're asking me to choose.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendealnet.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.